Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our tour through my Penguin Classic wall, book by book, author by author, sometimes organized according to a principle. We started out where I had organized a bit of the shelves into the works of ancient Greece and Rome, moved on into the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. Uh, Lately, we've been bouncing all around, although there have been commonalities. We hit a whole shelf of Dickens, hit a whole shelf of Trollope. Uh, and I imagine that will keep happening. I imagine that we will learn, we will hit strands that just go through a certain theme or whatnot, because occasionally the organizing yen has hit me with these bookcases. Not often, uh, but today may be the beginning of that. You never know. I've made a point of not studying, not looking ahead. But today is a slim work of Russian fiction. Very aside from Eugene Onegin, this could very well be called the forefather of all Russian fiction, especially the kind of realist 19th century Russian fiction that we all associate with that. I mean, the Russians kept writing after that. They've been writing long before that. But when we think of Russian literature, we think of their unbroken string of towering 19th century fiction writers who kind of wrote of a kind. They kind of wrote, I mean, they were all brilliant in their own way, but they wrote in a kind of fiction that was, the groundwork was laid by this person. That is not a stock photo. That is a portrait of Mikhail Lermontov. And he had many portraits throughout his lifetime. He was born in the teens. He was from a wealthy, noble family and had access from his earliest waking memories to a great library, many great libraries. Never wanted for anything, and it grew him up a little resentful of that, a little, as hyper smart young men will always be. In my opinion, that portrait is not what he looked like. He also did a portrait of himself. He was a very talented painter. Even in his teens, he was a very talented painter, and he did a self-portrait that doesn't look anything like this. The self-portrait that he did at around the same time looks like, if anything, the youngest son of this person. And interestingly enough, none of his portraits look the same. No matter who did them, none of them look the same. And that leads me to believe, I have seen that phenomenon before, and I have noticed that it only ever happens when the subject of the portraits has that weird, indefinable something that makes everyone attracted to them, but that isn't actually a feature of their physiognomy. And so every portrait writer, every portrait painter tries to nail down what that quality is. And since they're portrait painters, they have no alternative but to try and nail it down with some aspect of physiognomy, even though it's clearly not that. This painter, who is this? K. Gorbunov. This painter is obviously thinking, whether consciously or not, was thinking that the quality that is the magnifying quality of Lermontov, the thing that made everyone fascinated by him, is a sort of pensive sadness. And there are plenty of people, especially colleagues of his in his various military regiments, who would have said no, no. No matter what the quality is, it's not pensive sadness, because he was a roisterer. He was a dancer and a ladies' man, and physically very brave, physically the type of person who, if his regiment encountered trouble in the woods, as his actually did when he was fighting the Chechens, the type of person who would seek out the heart of that combat, won decorations for physical bravery, for hand-to-hand combat. And all while extremely young. The thing to remember about this author is that he was extremely young. He a lot of people who knew him said it was like he came into the world ready for a literary mission. He was writing poetry in his early teens, and by his late teens, his poetry was widely regarded as really good. Even as early as his late teens, his poetry, none of which is included in this volume, was being regarded as so good that it made him Pushkin's heir. Which was, if you know any fans of Russian literature, or especially Russian fans of Russian literature, compliments don't come any higher than that. and yet people were readily dispensing compliments like that to this person when he was, by anyone else's estimate, a boy. He seemed not to be happy. He affected an air of bored and somewhat distasteful ennui. picture some of the characters, some of the loungers who have sharp insides in, for instance, Tolstoy, and you will get the pattern here. Only in this case, the pattern is a living person, and he drank of Schiller and Byron right up to the roots of his hair. He knew their romantic, over the top works, their cult of personality works, like the back of his own hand, and a lot of his early poetry reflects that fact. But you can see him growing out of it. I know I'm talking all about his poetry. I will get to the novel, but his poetry is what brought him to a lot of people's attention, especially when he wrote a poem about the death of Pushkin, who died in a duel, and called it "The Death of a Poet," and it got everyone's attention, everyone, because he was critical of everything about the wasting of this poet's life, of this great literary man's life. And his criticism was not polite. It was, he even extended his criticism to the imperial machinery, to the machinery of government, which promptly got him on the wrong side of the law, got him exiled to a distant military posting. Could have got him much worse. People involved in the same scandal got much worse, and it made him feel terrible. It made him feel like his wealthy and noble connections had got him a lighter deal. We could stand very much to have an extended and annotated diary by this person, but keep in mind, we're still talking about a very, very young man who drank in his exile, used it for bravery, yes, used it for roistering and drinking and dancing and gambling and whatnot, but also drank it in artistically. And that was an element of Lermontov that he went to some extent to downplay and even to hide from people that he knew, even while he was growing in love with art. It was well before his 20th birthday that he realized that all of the ideas that he had for how he wanted to live paled in comparison with the literary life. And part of that had to do with an inner calling. Part of it probably also had to do with the fact that he almost never made a literary endeavor for the public that wasn't rapturously received. When he returned from his distant posting, he was the toast of society in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And like so many budding intellects then and now, he viewed Moscow as a kind of necessary stinkhole, and St. Petersburg is the place that inspired all of his creativity. It's a magical place. Those of you who haven't visited really should. It retains some of that magic even today. And eventually he wrote a book. He wrote a novel, this novel, which is about a young man, a very Lermontov young man called Pechorin, who is facing the same problems, dealing with the same ennui, wondering in the same ways what life's purpose is. It was a hit, a huge hit. It was run in a gigantically read political and literary journal. Think the New York Review of Books, only much more popular. The New York Review of Books is read by a tiny handful of people. Think about a national thing, a national New York Review of Books that had the same kind of steep literary quality, and you get something along those lines. And he published parts of this book there to rapturous acclaim. Critics weren't sure what to make of it, as critics sometimes aren't. This was a type of fiction that had not been seen in Russia before, not to this extent, and certainly not this well done. And he just kept going. He finished the book, and it was a huge hit. And so were his poems at the time, a huge hit. So much so that when there was a second edition, when he got a chance to go at the book again, he wrote a preface for it. Keep in mind, we're talking about a very, very young man, 22, 23 years old. He wrote a preface for it that, among many other things, is a very interesting work. I think it's included in this book. Among many other things, the preface is a little ginger on the subject of what we now call autofiction. Some critics and some friends of his have pointed out this is basically you. This is what you do. You're calling it a novel, but this is basically you. It's basically a memoir, and he was a little touchy about that, as writers of autofiction always are. But the note of touchiness that on his part seemed to be one of almost impatience with himself. And this book is so enjoyable. You can just imagine what he would have gone on to write. You can just imagine, you can easily see it in this book, that he was impatient even with his own experimentation, and that the preface that he wrote, sort of testily defending it, was a sure bellwether that he was going to go on to do other things, much more adventurous and innovative things. This Penguin Classic is translated by Paul Foote, and it's fairly good. It's 50 years old, and Foote revised it like 20 years ago. I'm not really sure why Penguin doesn't have a newer translation, unless they do, and I just don't know about it. Foote's translation is good, but there was you can hear it all the time when you read accounts. All right, we have many firsthand accounts of what Lermontov was like in conversation, in a ballroom, in private, what he was like to know, with many conversations, and some of them are very negative, very angry. He was splintery. He was unforgivingly funny. He was brutally intelligent and caustic. So much so that at one point, barracks mate of his was incensed enough to duel with him, just like Pushkin. Oh, and he survived, but that was not the only case. There were plenty of other cases where people in all rungs of society thought, well, okay, he is indispensable but intolerable, to use one phrase. The one phrase from one of those people: indispensable but intolerable. And the indispensability, sure, comes through in Foote's translation. Sure, it does. It's a good, solid translation. It will certainly show you that among his many other benefits as a writer, you can't stop reading him. Even in prose, you can't stop reading him. The one thing that doesn't come through in this translation is the insufferability. And believe me, it's there in the original. It's there. I have talked to so many people who worship this author, including Russians, who just I remember once years ago I showed an English language translation. I don't think it was Foote's, but it might have been. It's old enough so that it might have been. I showed an English language translation to a Russian friend of mine, and he was astounded. Just astounded. He said, I believe his exact words to me were, "You've made him Henry James." Not talking to me, talking to the translator, saying, "You've made him Henry James," and it wasn't a compliment. And I understand that, because even in my limited window into the original, I can see the flashes of spiky, unpredictable brilliance that Foote sort of Maud style tamps down. Maybe he's not even aware that he's doing it, but one way or another, his introduction is great, his notes are great, and this is, of course, one of the only versions of this. I don't know that Oxford makes one. Mentor Books used to make one. I don't think it was the Foote translation. I don't know how many translations there are of a hero of our time. I wish that there were more. I wish that this author were better known. I wish that there were no such thing as this. I wish that every time a major reprint house like Oxford or Penguin came out with a volume of Lermontov, it was this plus everything else. This plus everything else. The poetry. Even, spend the extra money and reprint his paintings, many of which are absolutely beautiful. That would be a great volume to have. I would definitely love a big volume of Lermontov that had everything. And the reason why I can say that you could do that in one volume, the reason why I use such a wistful tone when I talk about all of the things in this novel that give you a hint of what he might have done, is because his second duel didn't go as well as his first. At the age of 26, he went too far with someone, and that someone challenged him to a duel. Lermontov was pretty plain to friends of his. The standard mechanics of a duel at the time. The dueling was outlawed almost everywhere in the 1900s, and was severely frowned upon even when it wasn't outlawed. And the standard mechanics were that it was an affair of honor, and your honor was being challenged, and all that was required to make things even between the two parties was the discharge of guns. That's all. So that there was a standard protocol. You showed up at dawn at some usually picturesque wild place. You showed up with a partner, with a second. You showed up, and that was a mark of your courage. You didn't flee, because the announcement was made well ahead of time. You could flee if you were a physical coward. So you're one step along the way to show up at all. And you show up with your guns, and you point your gun at someone else across a very short distance. All of that means that two quarreling men are bringing things to as far as a quarrel can go. short of trial by combat. And then the last protocol is that you fire into the air. You don't fire at each other. You fire into the air, and then you cross the distance between you, and you shake hands. Many, many times in dueling situations like that, you not only shook hands, but then you went out drinking, a titanic drinking bout that bound you to that person closer than sometimes your closest friends. And honor is satisfied on both accounts. Every once in a while in a duel, some aspect of the whole situation had been so personal for one of the people involved that even when they learned that the other person intended to follow those protocols and fire into the air, the other person intended to shoot to kill. That's how America lost Alexander Hamilton, exactly that way. And that's what happened with Lermontov. The man that he had insulted shot him dead. And so we don't have anything. He died. He died well before the age of 30. We don't have anything except a bunch of poetry that even now shines from a 20-year-old. And a prototypical novel. All the rest, all the following, the rest of the 19th century Russian novels that we all know and love and can rattle off, they stem from this and Eugene Onegin. But I would say more from this. For a number of different reasons. I would say more from this. Because in addition to all of its trailblazing, the trailblazing that left a few critics cold, critics in their own way were wondering, what do we make of this? I mean, what is this? It doesn't seem like it's fiction. It also doesn't seem like there's anything to root for. But in addition to all of that, this has one element that nothing in Pushkin has, and that none of Lermontov's poetry has. The one element in A Hero of Our Time that is present and that I think led to a large amount of imitation in the rest of the 19th century is that it looks doable. You read it, if you're a budding Dostoevsky, if you're a budding Turgenev, you read it and you think, you're inspired. You think, oh my, I've never read anything like that before. Incredible. And then your next impulse is to do it yourself. Whereas Pushkin was so glacially brilliant that you look at his stuff and you don't think that. I know there are plenty of Pushkin imitations, but you look at his stuff, Eugene Onegin, you look at that and you think, okay, I've never read anything like this, that's amazing. And then in place of the reaction that says, I want to try that, you think, no one could do that. No one could. So I think this is more imitated. I think it's much more likely to lay at its feet a whole literary tradition, and that's amazing. But it's a terrific read on its own. It's difficult to read it, to reread it. I mean, it takes an hour to read. It's difficult to reread it without a tinge of sadness, because this was a person who wanted to start a literary career. He actually petitioned to get out of his army career so that he could devote himself to literary matters full time. And he was denied. That permission was denied. Had that permission been granted, he would never have been in a duel. At least that we know of. I mean, maybe his temperament would have put him in a duel, or maybe an aggrieved husband who'd been cheated on or something like that. But maybe not. And the military was more likely to do these things than anybody else. But he was denied that permission. And maybe he would have tried again. Maybe he would have asked again. All these would haves attend to Lermontov in a way that they don't to a lot of other Russian writers. So that's your Penguin for today. Even the Foot translation, which I don't think is exemplary, I still recommend, if only if you don't know this author. If you haven't encountered this author, you really should. You really, really should. And that is your Penguin for today. It's a partial recommend, even in the Penguin Classic. And we'll see where it leads us tomorrow. We'll see what turns up tomorrow. I will wrap this up for now, but I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.